How do you use a food scale to measure macros like a ball?
Don't you want to look good naked?
So a food scale is something that you can buy on Amazon for $10 to make your food tracking a lot more accurate and precise, and to allow you to be very objective with what you're doing versus subjective. And when I say objective versus subjective, when we're thinking about portion sizes and the world we live in today with the Big Macs and the double, triple, I don't even know, I haven't been to McDonald's for a while, whatever the XL foods are, there's a lot of large portions out there. So when it comes to having specific goals with maybe changing your body composition, it can be useful to use a food scale to be able to get more accurate with how much you're consuming versus relying on your, eyeballs or guesstimating things. And not saying that that can't be accurate at times, but it's not going to be as accurate as that objective metric. So a few tips and tricks to think about when you're using a food scale is, the first one is there is something called a tare button that is very, very useful. The reason I'm laughing is because I didn't realize you could do this for a long time, and once I figured it out, it was a game changer. So for example, if you're measuring out butter to cook vegetables in a frying pan, for example, instead of trying to put the frying pan on the food scale and measure the butter on top of that, don't try to do that because there's an easier way. So instead, just keep your frying pan on your stove, take the stick of butter and turn your food scale on, put the stick of butter on the scale, then press the tare button. It will go back to 0. Then you can take your knife and cut off a piece of butter and put it in the frying pan, and whatever you cut off from that butter is going to turn into a negative. So if you're looking to get about, 5 grams of butter, which is about a teaspoon, then you can, again, turn the food scale on, put the butter on the food scale, tare the food scale, take a knife, cut the butter, put that butter in the frying pan, look at what the negative number is on the food scale, and that's how much butter you used. So, just a tip, you can do that. I do this with my butters or oils, anything that I'm cooking with. I do it with nut butters, so putting a jar of peanut butter on the scale. Actually, you might not want to do this because it's very disappointing, but putting a jar of peanut butter on the scale and scooping out what you might think is a tablespoon. When you do this for the first time, it's very disappointing, like I said, but that's an easy way to make sure that you're being precise with the peanut butter, especially because things like nut butters and oils and things like that can really add up calorie-wise in terms of the amount that you're using. So nut butters, even protein powders, for example, like if I'm measuring out protein powders, sometimes, especially if you're being super precise, that scoop of protein powder, it might not be as accurate as you think it is. And this takes me back to when I was with my grandmother and baking, and she would always tell me to not pack down the flour into the measuring cup when we were making cookies. So the more you pack it down, you could actually be adding a lot more flour than you think. So the same thing goes for protein powder. Even though you might take that scoop of protein powder and you think it's maybe 30 grams, for example, you might be getting 35 to 40 grams even. So if you're trying to be super precise with your tracking, I would just definitely make sure that with those types of things that you're using the food scale and using that tare feature so that you're getting more accurate with that. It's not that that probably makes a big difference, if you do that once or twice, but if you're doing that consistently, like day in, day out, week after week, especially with peanut butter, that can add up. So an extra 5 grams here, an extra 5 grams there, it adds up really quickly. So again, it's just something to think about. And if you have the food scale, sitting on your counter, sitting in your kitchen, I would utilize it. And that's what I do, because not only is it going to make things more accurate, but it's also going to save you dishes to wash. Nobody likes to wash dishes. So when it comes to what type of metric you should be using on the food scale, whether that's grams, ounces, milliliters, this is gonna all come back to your preference and what makes the most sense for you when you're tracking. So for me, I typically like to keep all of my meats. So if I'm measuring out any type of meat, or yogurt or cottage cheese, for example, I typically do that all in ounces. And then anything that's, like powders or nut butters or oils and things like that, I typically do that all in grams or milliliters. It's the same thing when you're doing grams and milliliters, so just pick one. But the main thing is just staying consistent with it, and also paying attention to when you're tracking cooked versus uncooked food. That's something that you definitely want to make sure that you are being consistent with that as well. And I have a whole video on whether or not you should track raw versus cooked foods if you want to check that out. Just paying attention to staying consistent with whether or not you're using ounces or grams or milliliters really just comes back to what's easiest for you and what makes the most sense over the long term for you. One other reason to think about using a food scale is that it's actually gonna make you more aware of those portion sizes, so that when you do go out to restaurants or you're eating at someone else's house, you're gonna realize that the more you kind of understand how much you're consuming and you can see those numbers on the scale, the more awareness that's gonna bring if you go out to a restaurant and someone puts, a chicken breast in front of you and you're trying to think about, okay, how do I track this? How big is this chicken breast? Is it 6 ounces? Is it 8 ounces? So if you have no recollection of that, if you have I kind of call it like muscle memory. If we think of muscle memory, it's thinking about kind of food memory, right? So if you're home and you're using your food scale on a normal basis and you're measuring things out, it's just gonna train your brain to know, okay, this is about 6 ounces of chicken. This is about 8 ounces of chicken. Same with other things. This is about a tablespoon of butter, or this is about a tablespoon of peanut butter. So it's just kind of teaching you more awareness, so that down the line, maybe you don't have to use the food scale forever, you don't have to use a tracking app forever, but you're building up that awareness so that you're more aware of those portion sizes, and it's going to allow you to create more of that structure and even freedom down the line. Women, we believe